All right, everyone. Hello. We're back with part 3 of our interview with our fascinating, insightful, entertaining interview with Dr. Chris Thomas, who is the author of the book A Pentecostal Reads the Book of Mormon. We've covered his early years, some of it lightly. We've talked about what it's like to be a Pentecostal, what some of their beliefs and practices are. And then that was kind of the first hour, and we talked a little bit about Chris's journey into taking an interest in Mormonism. And then for part 2, we talked about his analysis of the Book of Mormon and what an important contribution that is to our people. So thank you, Chris, Dr. Thomas, for that. Part 3, it's going to be just kind of a scattering of a lot of different topics. So let's see. Let's start with this. I am probably not considered to be part of the Mormon studies community. I do have a PhD. I have published 10 or 12 journal articles on social science and Mormonism, but usually the Mormon studies crowd is more historians and maybe some philosophers and again, some theological religious studies kind of people. But I'm aware of kind of some of the political sensitivities, the controversies, and of course I'm very familiar with the tension between apologists and more orthodox believers in the Mormon studies community and those who might be described as more progressive or liberal in that tradition and some of the tensions there. So I can't imagine, I guess I can imagine that to some degree it would be really refreshing and welcome to have a Gentile who, especially an evangelical, that takes an interest and I would think Orthodox scholars would love you just because you're a thoughtful evangelical that takes the Book of Mormon seriously.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily classify myself as an evangelical.
Okay, why not? What's the difference? Teach us what that means.
Worldview stuff. There are a lot of evangelicals. If you lay down the fivefold gospel, where you do and don't have uniformity on that. And again, I kind of think worldview, the whole thing of gifts, spiritual gifts and such. It's a worldview issue, and so evangelicalism. I probably could sign certain statements of faith, but that doesn't capture what Pentecostals are as such. So that's why I didn't call it an evangelical reads the Book of Mormon.
So Pentecostals don't consider themselves part of the evangelical
some do, and some don't.
But you don't. Okay.
I just don't identify first with that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, still, I think the point that I was trying to make kind of stands.
Fair
enough. Any non-Mormon Christian, scholar taking the Book of Mormon seriously, I imagine would be just very welcome, which contributes probably at least in part to why BYU and the Maxwell Institute likes to have you around, I'm guessing. But it still can be a complicated landscape to navigate. Is there anything you want to talk about what it's like to navigate the Mormon studies kind of community?
Yeah, being an outsider is you can talk to everybody. Mm-hmm. So you don't have to pick and choose. You don't have to only talk with certain people, right? So I've had dinner with Dan Peterson and dinner with Sandra Tanner. Not at the same time, mind you, but with both. I have had conversations with Jack Welch and Ed Wunderly. Mm-hmm. I'm friends with a couple of apostles in the Community of Christ Church, and I've recently had a lovely time with Marlon Jensen. I'm able, I think part of it comes from my New Testament training. When I'm looking at a text, I read everybody, right? I don't just read more conservative people, or I don't X out Roman Catholic scholars, or, so I'm used to that in terms of reading. I was struck by the fact that, having studied a little with Community of Christ scholars, that often LDS Book of Mormon scholars and Community of Christ Book of Mormon scholars didn't necessarily know one another and didn't necessarily work closely together. And I'm thinking, man, this thing's way too small to not, I mean, how many Book of Mormon scholars are there, right? Mm-hmm. And so that was one of the things that I think that's come out of this new kind of academic group called the Book of Mormon Studies Association, to try to forward sort of an academic engagement across the board on the Book of Mormon, which has had some promise. And yeah, I think the people that I think my advantage, John, is that I do read with the text. Mm-hmm. If I were a historical, critical oriented New Testament scholar, then I would have to figure out the Zitzumleben of the book. And most historical, critical New Testament scholars are going to say 19th century. Now we got to figure out how Joseph does this, mm-hmm. right? And because that's not my starting point, there are a lot of things that I can talk to a lot of people about and receive help because of the approach that I'm taking. Mm-hmm. So I think it's kind of, almost perfect storm. What was it in Field of Dreams? All the cosmic tumblers have clicked into place. Mm-hmm. And so I think there are some people that are more interested in talking to me than others. Mm-hmm. I think there are a group of people who study the Book of Mormon, whether they would be considered Book of Mormon scholars or not, that are so focused on historical issues that that's the only game in town, mm-hmm. and they're not interested in some of the others. I've been struck by some of the divisions in terms of how the lay of the land is. But I've also been struck by how many people seem to have a genuine interest in engagement. I always try to keep in mind what it's like in the Society for Pentecostal Studies when we have somebody from the outside come in. What do I appreciate about their etiquette, so to speak, their decorum, right? And I don't say this to feign humility. One of my colleagues once said, "Oh, don't feign humility." I said, "Well, when you don't have any, that's all you can do is feign it." But usually, when I engage people about the Book of Mormon, everybody in the room knows more than I do about the Book of Mormon. So I don't have any, sense of superiority in any way. I do think in the field of Mormon studies that we're starting to see a shift, not unlike what we've seen in the Society for Pentecostal Studies, from mainly history-based things to other sorts of examinations. And so there's a pretty thriving group of psychology folk in Pentecostalism who explore the dimensions of, what is that like in terms of a Pentecostal practice, et cetera. And I think some of the really creative stuff that's going on these days, creative in a good sense, not fanciful, are some of the readings of the text and some of the theological constructions of the text. I think the history will continue to be done, and I don't just mean origins history. I mean, Mormon history. And there's lots of fascinating stuff, and I'm happy to see a lot that's being done with reception history. And I've said,
what is that?
It's how a text is received by, it's not just history of interpretation, but how a text is received in art and literature and in everyday practice. I've often said to my biblical studies colleagues who are LDS, one of the great contributions you can make to the academy is to do those kinds of reception pieces on the Book of Revelation, on the Gospel of John, etc. Tell us what Mormon interpreters have said about this, even at the popular level, because reception is really hot right now in the discipline. And if you go to a Society of Biblical Literature meeting, for example, lots of reception history pieces. Well, an outsider is more challenged to dig into that because we don't really know where to go than an insider is. And so I do think you're starting to see that. And I think that, for example, I was elected the inaugural president of the Book of Mormon Studies Association. And I think that in part was kind of optics, that this group has a different kind of identity and feel and scope. We've had people from Community of Christ be present. We've had people from the Church of Jesus Christ, the Bickerton group, Daniel Stone. Lots of similarities in worship between the Church of Jesus Christ and Pentecostal worship. And so we've had some really interesting chats together about what all that is about. And, he wrote this nice biography of Bickerton, and I counted up, there were like 40 references to speaking in tongues. And I said, man, Daniel, I was amazed by that. He said I had to take out a lot. The editor took a lot out. I'm like, there were more? He said, yeah, there were more. So I do think that it's an emerging, that there are these shifts that are going on in the discipline. Part of the difference in being a Pentecostal scholar and being a Mormon scholar is there are little Pentecostal schools all over creation and all over the world. And for LDS folk, there's 3 BYU campuses and Southern Virginia University. And I think in some ways it's more difficult for the critical mass of Mormon studies folk to be able to just kind of land in jobs sometimes.
Sure.
And yeah, so.
There's this sort of tension oftentimes between those who, the Mormon position on the Book of Mormon is it's such a phenomenal work that no uneducated schoolboy like Joseph Smith could have ever created it, that it's got so many voices and so much complexity, so much narrative complexity, that certainly no human could have ever written that book, and certainly not in the time frame that we understand, it to have been written in. Do you have are you even in a position where you're able to comment on that question, or do you avoid that kind of?
Well, I didn't talk any about that in the book. I think looking at the original manuscript and the printer's manuscript kind of demythologizes that a bit.
Because it's using the vernacular.
It looks rough. It's not. It hasn't taken the form of Scripture that it will take later. I think Joseph, from all indications, was an incredibly bright individual and a great storyteller, and somebody who was very charismatic in that sense. And so, I think you can explain things in lots of different ways. I've sometimes gotten, I was out at some Eccles group study in Los Angeles. And
Miller Eccles.
Yes, right. Yeah. In conjunction with going out to Claremont. And one of the people, asked me, well, why don't you believe this is Scripture, having spent all this time with the book? And I said, well, there are different ways of reading. There are different ways of thinking about how this comes to be. One of the things that's going on right now with me in this most recent project is just how much biblical language is in the book. And at the reading level, in what way the Bible is the linguistic lexicon for the readers. Now, if you flip that around and then talk about authorship and all that, you can do that. But I'm I've kind of been stunned by the extent of that in this last project.
By the amount of King James
and
version of the Bible.
And it's not, it's not the long quotes, it's the little snippets. I once saw an interview with Ted Koppel when Jim and Tammy ran into their problems, right?
Faye Baker.
Yeah. And at one point, Koppel says something like, "Please don't speak to me in Bibleese." And I'm thinking to myself, boy, you don't know this guy. That's his vocabulary. And I get that sense, at least for the readers that I'm constructing out of the book. Similarly, I mean, it's thick in the book, and it's much more complex than did somebody copy something, right? There is this kind of formative stuff. At least we can say about the reader, whatever we say about whoever writes it.
Right.
Yeah.
What do you make of, my sense is you've gotten a taste for the war between apologists and critics. Does your tradition have a version of apologists like the Dan Petersons, like the Lewis Midgeleys, like the Bill Hamlins? Do you have a tradition of kind of hard-knuckled apologists? And whether you do or not, do you have a commentary on the fruitfulness or the lack of fruitfulness of the battle between Mormon apologists and critics over the years? Or do you even have exposure to that or interest in it?
Well, I'm sure in a tradition as vast as Pentecostalism, I mean, they say there's like 600 million Pentecostal globally.
That's a lot.
And that the majority are in the Southern Hemisphere, the majority are young, the majority are people of color, the majority are women or female, and the majority are illiterate. Okay? So to try to speak for that,
yeah, right.
I can't in a correlated way, you might say.
Sure.
And I'm sure somewhere you got that kind of stuff going on. I mean, obviously you've always had in any religious tradition people who function as apologists, right? You're kind of steadying the people inside and hoping to make points with the people outside, right? So I think that, my dad used to say a dog that won't bark in his own yard ain't worth having, right? And so I would not be opposed to being an apologist for Pentecostalism, but I think that there's a point at which certain apologetic approaches reach a point of diminishing returns. And, I certainly don't think, without getting into details, I certainly don't think that in academic conversations there's any need for vitriol or ad hominem attacks, or I don't think you got a testimony or that sort of thing. I mean, I just think that I just don't find that helpful, and I don't mean that just about the LDS community. I mean that generally, right? I did have a professor, an old guy named John Bright, up at Princeton at one summer. He wrote the Anchor Bible commentary on Jeremiah, and he said, now and he had a Bear Bryant kind of voice. He spoke very deeply, and he said, now, folk, when you don't have much to back up your point, you bang the pulpit and speak loudly. Well, sometimes when people make a lot of noise, they're either covering, or my assessment of human nature is, or they're insecure, or they're defensive, or something's going on that's a sign of, and I've run into people like that, not just in LDS circles. And so, you learn human nature a little bit, not nearly as much as your exposure has been, but, you can often see what the issue is and isn't. So is that?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So regarding, let's see. So regarding your place in kind of the landscape, I'm just trying to think about what part I want to tackle next. So,
Let me go back just for a
go
second.
ahead.
I am not naive to the fact that of what an outsider means
Mm-hmm.
in these conversations.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But I think that kind of works both ways.
Well, my instinct is that you're celebrated because you're an outsider.
Yeah, and I think that comes with it, but I think there has to be, and I think there has been and continues to be, kind of an honest kind of engagement.
Mm-hmm.
I don't feel compelled not to talk to certain people. Okay, I mean, I think we all have to have our integrity and our independence, and I know what it. You know, I have a friend who was at the U for about 20 years, education department, Pentecostal guy, and he always raved about BYU, just about across the board. Extraordinary reputation, you know, in various ways. And I think the history, in terms of, say, something like Book of Mormon studies, I think there's a real desire to reach out and to have outsiders engaged. I think this becomes an opportunity for, you know, the university to do that in a way that is part of the larger conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that for Mormon studies to take the next step, and I may not be qualified to say this, but as we say in Pentecost, if you got the microphone, you got the service, right? I think in Mormon studies, I think there needs to be a more significant engagement by outsiders for the discipline to prosper.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I say that in part as somebody who knows what it's like to work within Pentecostal circles and be very committed to drinking from our own wells and from constructing for our people. I don't mean that in that sense, but I know how enriching it is to engage people from outside the tradition in a variety of ways. I'll give you two examples. There's not a day in my life when I wake up in the morning that I'm not aware that globally there are better people than me in my tradition, that are better Christians than I am, that are better Pentecostals than I am, that are brighter than I am, that never get this opportunity, and I won the lottery ticket.
You love it that much?
And
Is that what you're saying?
as a Pentecostal, that's
Mm-hmm.
right. And I feel a real stewardship for that, for them,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I'm not.
Do you see this work as a privilege?
Yeah, to do the work I do as a Pentecostal scholar, yeah. I feel it's a calling.
Not just the stuff with Mormonism. Just
No,
generally.
that's right. Generally,
Okay,
yeah.
okay.
And I don't see this as, you know, when I started this project, I talked to my presiding bishop and my president and said, look, I'm going to do some research that might prove controversial, and I wanted you to have the heads up on it.
Mm-hmm.
And they both, you know, blessed it, and they both said, okay, so what's the controversial part? I said, you know what the controversial part is. So, I mean, I think there is a sense in which we all have to be responsible for that, right? For our people, especially when the demographics are so extraordinary and the challenges are so many. The other thing I would say is that when we started the Journal of Pentecostal Theology back about 1992, this press in England, academic press there, in every issue we decided to have an outside dialogue partner. And so at the same time, I believe that dialogue, for myself, I believe dialogue is important, right? I do think there has been a dearth of people from the outside interested in the Book of Mormon, or I should say it this way, in anything other than the historical issues. So I think it's kind of an interesting time in Mormon studies. I mean, that's just kind of my outside observations.
I don't mean to be self-serving in this question, but I'm just curious. Maybe you've met Michael Quinn or know of his work. Maybe you've met Brett Metcalf or know of his work. You obviously follow my stuff. I'm sure you know about the September 6 and Lavina and some of the other people. What do you make of? What do you have to say about trying to understand or grapple with the way the church has handled people in the past who have tried to look at Scripture critically? Even David Wright, or David Bokovoy. How do you make sense of the struggle between an institution fighting for its life, but also the way it's handling people that are trying to look at it critically? Do you have sympathy for the church? Do you have, criticism for the church? Like
it's really not my place to say, but I think that tension, you feel that tension in larger places. It's not just an LDS issue. I think there are boundaries, communal boundaries, to different communities of faith. There are occasionally Pentecostal scholars who step outside the boundaries. Sometimes I would concur with those assessments. Sometimes I wouldn't. What has struck me about many LDS scholars that have either been disciplined or in some kind of trouble is how few of them, well, let me say it differently. I don't think I know of any of them who haven't really loved the church and loved truth and are trying to navigate their way in all that. One of the surprising things to me about Mormonism, kind of, moving from the front porch into the back porch conversations, is just how diverse Mormon thought is. From the outside, it looked all monolithic, right? But I've just been amazed at how diverse it is and the different layers and levels of diversity. And I can't quite get my head around it, why certain people can say certain things and be disciplined and other people say the same things and not be disciplined.
Like Von Brody versus Richard Bushman, right?
Yeah.
Well, it's just, do you come down on the side of faith or not? I think it might be that simple.
Yeah.
You can get away with a lot if you're okay with faith. If you're not okay with faith, then you're kind of toast.
Yeah, and who's the arbiter of faith?
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, I find those kinds of, I find that I don't want to be the person that makes that call.
Sure.
But if I'm paid to teach at, say, the Church of God Theological Seminary, and I have great differences with that, with the statement of faith that I sign every year, then I might ought to go somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not speaking for anybody else but myself there. I do think there's a certain logic there, right? If I'm being entrusted with the formation of members and ministers, then, I knew what I signed up for.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean that I don't have the kind of freedom to figure out the faith and the best forms of the faith. I mean, we are people who look at foot washing as a sacrament. Well, I didn't take credentials in the church till I knew where I was going in my thesis.
Mm-hmm.
Because I didn't want to be saying, well, I believe this, but I don't really believe this, right? And I'm not speaking for others. on that, or telling other people how they need to do their stuff. I do think there needs to be a lot more, generally across the board, not just LDS. I think there needs to be a lot more sympathy with people in what they are engaging. We're all going to have struggles before this life's over, and we all need help. And I'm the kind of personality that if you love me, you can say anything to me, and if you don't, I'm not going to hear a word you say. Right? Because I know where it's coming from. And I think to have those kind of hearts is needed kind of across the board. Right? In the Church of God, just to speak of my own denomination, we've had relatively few biblical and theological scholars. And so it's kind of a different world. But I know recently of a scholar or two that have been let go of other Pentecostal schools over what seemed to me to be something they shouldn't have been let go for.
Sure.
Yeah.
What about Mormon Stories podcast has been interesting to you then, knowing that I'm kind of more in the dissident sort of, or at least I'm framed that way. Why have you been interested? I'm just curious.
Well, you're a great interviewer,
for
one thing, right? And I like it when you get embarrassed when I brag on you like that, Dr. DeLynn. And you have such interesting guests. And, of course, I've just learned tons about Mormon history, the LDS world. You know, I came in not being bilingual at all.
So right. Cultural stuff?
Well, cultural, historical, kind of theological. I mean, it's hard to kind of pull the threads out, isn't it? Yeah. And so, yeah, I mean, you ask great questions. You live your life out in public, in full view of everybody. I'm not that person. I'm not even on social media. And my daughter said, "I want to start a fan page for you, Dad." And I said, No, don't do that. And I really admire that. That's hard to do. And you've been quite upfront about the wear and tear of all that, and your own searching and struggling on where we go with this now. We find our place in this thing. I mean, I think you were a bit hard on your mom, but she seemed to be able to take it. And she seems to really love you. And so, no, I mean, there's so many of them. And my problem with your podcast, the Mormon Story podcast, is I'll start one at night at like 10 or 11. And it's like an 8-parter. And, about 3, I'm saying, I got to go to bed. I got to turn this off. I can pick up with this tomorrow. But it's to me, it's a great resource. And I've probably watched 100 hours of it.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you.
Do you follow kind of Russell M. Nelson, what he's doing to kind of evolve the church? Do you even have thoughts or observations about that, or do you just, again, not think about that much or try and stay away from that? Because, I mean, I'm sure Pentecostalism has had to confront modernity and make changes.
Well, it's all interesting to me. I don't understand a number of things, so I'm not always picking up on the significance in real time necessarily. I did ask a friend of mine to give President Nelson a message for me, and that was that I've come to the conclusion that women in the LDS Church should be given temple recommends, whether they tithe or not, whether they do any callings or not, just for bringing their kids to church on Sunday morning every Sunday. So if it happens, you'll know where it came from.
So you've attended some LDS. Are you just saying their meetings are boring? Is that kind of what you're saying?
No, I'm saying in the last sacrament meeting I was in, I was just struck. I mean, for one thing, with all the young children, right?
Yeah.
And how relatively quiet they all are, but how, kind of multitasking the moms are.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a statement of admiration in that regard.
Sure. So let's talk about faith.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yep.
So this is where this is where it gets kind of personal for me and complicated. And so I just want to talk to you just about faith and its relevance in the 21st century, and your faith, and then just to kind of get a new perspective on the value of Christian belief in these days. Is that okay?
Yep.
Okay.
Sure.
So, have you ever questioned whether God is there? Have you ever had kind of the Mother Teresa-like moments of real doubt and questioning in that regard?
Well, I think my guess would be everybody has, right? And there would be times when you feel that more intently than others. The perennial problems of suffering. In my tradition, we do believe the Lord heals physically. And I pray for the sick every week. And sometimes people will come back and tell me they experienced a healing when I didn't feel anything going on in the prayer. And then there would be times when, it's like heaven came down and nothing happens. Mm-hmm. Or God heals somebody, and I've said this to the Lord, I wouldn't have healed him, Lord. He's a sorry guy. And then some saint is left in their suffering, right? I mean, those are hard things. I remember this young woman. She was about 8 on a Sunday night. I'm leaving the church. Her parents are still up around the altar. She's in the second row. And I patted her on the head, and I think I may have kissed her on the head.
Okay.
And 2 days later, she had died. And you're there, with the parents who want to pray that she's resurrected. Sure, those are tough. I mean, right. I understand people who struggle with there being a God with all the evil and negative stuff. I kind of think it's almost impossible to think about that there's no God because of the good stuff.
Like what?
The love people have for other folk. The way in which you have people who show, in unselfish ways, concern for other people. Where does that come from? Is it just the roll of the dice? And I was coming back from a meeting at Princeton, and I was on the plane. It was one of those nights I was just worn out. I didn't want to talk to anybody, and this woman sat down beside me, and she was wanting to talk. Turns out she was a church secretary somewhere, but she didn't believe in the devil. And I said, "You know why I believe in the devil?" She said, "Why is that?" I said, "Adolf Hitler." I said, "You explain Adolf Hitler to me in any other way. That's evil, right?" So yeah, I mean, I think there are lots of things that challenge you, But I love my girls. I have 2 daughters and I have 2 grandchildren, and I love them, I believe, more than my own life. And you want them to be what God's called them to be. You want them to be everything He's created them to be. I don't want them to be clones of me. I don't want them to be codependent on me. I want them to be who they are. But you don't want them to get hurt. Right. And I'm writing this commentary on Revelation, and there's this text about the two witnesses. When they get opposed, fire, they can call down fire from heaven. They can do all these things in defense of themselves. But when their testimony is complete, the beast from the abyss comes and overcomes them and kills them. But it's not till their testimony is complete. It's not a triumphalism. But it's kind of comfort to me to know that God will protect them till their testimony is complete. Of course, I want that to be a ripe old age kind of testimony.
Mm-hmm.
There's another scene in the Apocalypse where the souls under the altar cry out, "How long, O God, how long? Till you will avenge our death." And you go all the way through the Apocalypse, and in chapter 16, the altar speaks and says, "Faithful and true are your judgments." It's almost as though those who have cried out for vindication are saying it's enough, good enough. We see that. And if they can see that, then it gives me hope that maybe I can see that one day. I feel those tensions. I feel those tensions. If you work in pastoral ministry, unless you harden your heart, you can't avoid that. So do I have questions? Yes. Have there been dark nights of the soul? Of course. Have there been times when you think, God, you really better be up there? I'm reminded of C.S. Lewis's wife, Joy, when she's dying, and she says to him, "Jack, you better be right about all this."
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, of course.
Because it goes beyond a blessing not coming true. It's war and pestilence and famine and abuse and just all poverty, all the horrific things about humanity. There's no quick answer to the theodicy problem, but
no.
Do you have a brief way that you've kind of made sense for all the pain and suffering in the world yourself and the idea of an all-powerful or an all-loving God?
Well, what I talked about would be my steps. I just don't think, for example, that anybody who is not, well, I've sometimes said it this way, I don't believe anybody who's not Jewish has a right to say anything about the Holocaust. It's too sacred, I guess I remember what Elie Wiesel said about this young kid who was had enough in the concentration camp, and he tries to make a run for it, and he doesn't make it, and they basically crucify the kid on the wall, the wire fence. And they asked Wiesel, "Where is your God now?" And he said, "He's on that fence with that boy." There's a form of my tradition and kind of the prosperity gospel, that you got to be wealthy and healthy and wise. And I wish it were true, but, sometimes where I find God is in those real moments of despair and loss. And he's, it reminds me of Corrie ten Boom's words as she's going to what she thinks is her death. She said, "There's no pit so deep that he's not deeper still." That's, despite all the contradictions and all the tensions, that's kind of where I am.
And this is me just to be very, very clear, I don't believe in trying to mess with people's faith. So my questions come from someone who had faith and lost it, and as someone who works with a lot of people who have lost their faith. So let's start there. This conversation is just to explore, right?
Sure.
Not to challenge.
Right.
Because your faith is very beautiful to me, and I know to my listeners. So I give you my respect for that. And then I hope, and I know you're resilient enough, you've been around the block enough to have this conversation.
Yeah, sure.
So let me just ask you a question about what you just said. There's sort of God as comforter in times of trouble, and then there's the idea of God as just a hope when there would otherwise be no hope, or a sense of reason or meaning or purpose when otherwise this pain and suffering would just be meaningless. So those are two different things.
Yep.
I imagine at least God as comforter is an important thing for you, or you probably would say you experience God's comfort. So I'm curious about that, and then also just the idea of God as hope, just in an otherwise senseless, violent world. Are both of those at play for you, or just?
Oh yeah, when you work and live with people on the margins, working poor, immigrants, and you come into church on a Wednesday night, just kind of depleted yourself, and you see people who have no right to be happy and joyous, being happy and joyous. It affects me, right? Who in some regards have much more to be happy and joyous about than they. And I think coupled with that, John, is just seeing people who've come in to, when my girls went off to university, I said, oh, look, there are going to be a lot of people who are going to challenge your faith. There are going to be a lot of people who don't believe in God. I said, I don't want you to ever forget, and I named the people, what you saw God do in their lives. There's this one guy, notorious sinner in the community. We're having this revival. He comes in, gets saved, baptized in the Spirit. His whole life changes. And my dad would get stopped on the street and they'd say, Preacher Fritz, we don't know what happened to Jerry, but he's a different person. Those are, to use Paul's language, are kind of living epistles, right? Where you see the power of God. I mean, I've seen healings. My dad had a stroke, and I'm there, and I'm shifting into pastoral care mode. His left side's basically paralyzed, and so they're taking him down to have a CAT scan or MRI or something. And they said, now, Pastor Fritz, you need to lay still here. And so Dad told me later, he said, and so I was praying. And I said, Lord, if you'll just touch my leg, you don't have to touch my arm. Just let me be able to walk. Bring him back. A few minutes, they come back after him. They said, Pastor Fritz, you were moving your leg around too much in that. We couldn't get a good picture. Can you come back down? Got the wheelchair there, and he says to my mom, Betty, do you want to see a miracle? And he walked down for the procedure. Well, explain it however you want to. We took that as the hand of God right there. He could die tomorrow, but I know that, and I've seen too much. I've seen, here's the tension of Pentecostalism. We had a brother in the church who was dying of cancer, and we prayed for him. Had a young boy, wife. Gary doesn't get healed, he dies. And I was talking to Gary about, before he died, I said, Gary, I said, my dad died when I was 2. He was killed in that wreck, and I said, but God was faithful to me, and he'll be faithful to your boy. Well, I think the The funeral was the week before. That next Wednesday night, a sister in the congregation said, I've just been diagnosed with breast cancer. She comes for prayer. You know who's with her? Gary's wife. It's that tension, right? It's that already not yet tension. It's all of that. So yes, hope. My gosh, yeah, it is hope. It is the hope that he's there, that he's coming for us, that it's the same Jesus we know as Savior who is returning. It's not a different one. It's not a, it's, my girls had been to the youth group once and they watched one of these scary Christian movies, about the return of Jesus. And they wanted to talk to me about it. They're kind of tore up. And I said, think of it this way. When Dad goes off, and I was going to England a good bit in those days, I said, when I'm coming back from England, are you afraid when I come back? Well, no, we love you. We want you to come back. Well, it's the same. It's the same Jesus, we believe, that is coming, right? So, yeah, hope. Yeah, certainly.
For some, and I love hearing that you understand that the problem with believing in miracles is making sense of the times when God doesn't intervene.
Yes, that's the pastoral problem.
And my guess is you don't have an answer for that, because how would you know the mind and will of God, and that Isaiah 55, that, my ways are higher than your ways kind of thing.
Yep.
Is that kind of where you have to go with that?
Yeah, I wrote a book called The Devil, Disease, and Deliverance. And what I wanted to look at was origins of illness, according to the New Testament. And what I found was about 10% were attributed to the devil or demons. About 10% were attributed to God as kind of pedagogical devices. 80% was just kind of part of the woodwork, right? There are times when I pray for people, and James says if they've committed sin, right? I don't start there, but sometimes people will confess. Sometimes people are battling God. Sometimes they're just sick. And I don't think I have to diagnose it all to try to figure out what's going on. But I do think I'm called to be faithful in praying for people. I don't heal them. Let me tell you one more story. There was a woman, you'll always remember her name, named Betty Davis. Betty was about 6 foot tall. She was like me. She's stocky, puffy, as my youngest daughter said at one point. She was really gruff. And when I would say, what do you want me to pray for, Betty? She would always just say, diabetes.
What?
That's how she responded. She had diabetes.
Oh, pray for her diabetes, yeah.
Well, I probably prayed for Betty 200 times. So how do you have an expectancy for healing when you see Betty coming down the aisle? So my old friend the devil, when I'd see her coming, he'd say, so you going to pray for her again, are you? And you know what I always remembered? That my grandmother was healed from diabetes, went off insulin for years because she was healed. So that's how I kind of live in that tension, John. I wish I could say Betty got healed on that 201st time, but she didn't. So yeah, it's a pastoral issue. There are ways to think through it and to try, but it is so beyond me to make sense of all that.
Okay. Yeah, it is. This is a long shot, but have you ever heard of the book, The Demon-Haunted World by Carl Sagan?
I know of Sagan, of course. I do not know that book.
So this is again, not in the spirit of challenging, but just in conversation. And I'm sure you've heard about these arguments in different ways. He and others have made the point that there's the point that number one, maybe something you're not doing, but maybe many Christians would, is acknowledge that a lot of times prayers aren't successful. So there's the failure rate that maybe less honest or straightforward Christians would kind of just ignore or forget, not intentionally. there are known charlatans. If you see the movie,
Of course.
if you see the movie, An Honest Liar, with the work of the amazing James Randi, he would go and film these faith healers that would have little wires in their ear, and they would have some lady who would have gotten prior knowledge about the people, and then he would act like he was conjuring up information about the people he shouldn't know, or he would plant someone in a wheelchair and then heal them miraculously. I mean, you acknowledge that
Oh, yeah.
that the history of Christianity maybe has some of that, if not a lot of it.
Fletch lives.
Right. Yeah. Right. Chevy Chase. That's good. So there's that.
Yeah.
And then there's, I think, what science would call spontaneous remission or whatever. Just a lot of, doctors will misdiagnose. So say there's a stroke or cancer when they just got it wrong. And so what ends up just being a bad diagnosis could get interpreted as a healing.
Yep.
And then there's also spontaneous remission. A certain amount of cancer is going to go into remission, and a certain amount of heart disease or whatever is going to, whether or not there's a prayer involved, right?
Yeah.
And then the most, and I acknowledge that this is a little bit, I don't want to say contentious, but it's, skeptical. The thing that's most often cited is just this idea that somehow God never heals a severed spinal cord, or he never heals, a severed limb. There are certain types of things that just never experience remission. They never, there's no instance of a healing of an arm being put back on, or a certain level of a spinal cord severance, So, I don't expect that you can really have an answer for all that, but I'm aware of that kind of stuff, and so I'm just wondering if you have thoughts around all that kind of stuff or not. And it's okay if you just say, no, I don't.
Oh, sure. Really. I mean, are there charlatans? Yeah, I've known them.
Really?
Yeah.
Even in your tradition?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Kind of on the fringe of the tradition, but still. I mean, I sometimes say about Pentecostalism that don't be confused by the mutations on TV. Go to one of the places I went in Provo. There's this little Hispanic Pentecostal church, and you talk about earnest in worship and earnest in living their lives for the Lord. And my Spanish is terrible. But I went and felt the presence of the Lord. And, I usually say, go to a storefront. Go somewhere where you see the real deal. There are people that fake a lot of things. It's smoke and mirrors, right? And I say to our congregation, don't, I'll say, how many of you have been healed? Not smoke and mirrors. God touched you at a certain point. Various hands go up. There was a guy named Walter Hollenweger who was sort of the dean of Pentecostal studies. He had grown up Pentecostal, joined the Swiss Reformed Church, began to do all kind of PhD supervisions at the University of Birmingham in England. And he told me, for a fact, that he was asked to translate for an evangelist named William Branham in Switzerland. And he knew Branham did not have any information on people. And he said he revealed amazing details about them. Now, Walter felt like that was just some people are clairvoyant. He didn't necessarily attribute that to the Spirit. But I have seen some of that where I knew the inside on it, right? So yeah, despite all of the foolishness, I guess the way I work through that, John, is despite the foolishness, I've seen the real deal. And I don't know every person who's had the different kinds of infirmities you described. Has nobody ever been healed by that? But, my sense is that in any case, God is gracious with those spontaneous healings, or however we want to attribute it. I mean, we recently had a woman in our congregation who was diagnosed with a massive growth, and she was having to go to Emory University to have it removed. And they take her in and do a final x-ray, and it's gone. Well, okay. I mean, I'm not telling people they have to attribute it to this or that, but that fits with the worldview that I know from my walk with the Lord.
This is the last question I'll ask about this. I've heard the argument that if somebody has the power to heal, they should go directly to a hospital full time and just heal everybody in the hospital all day long. Do you even have a thought? Have you thought about that type of argument?
And I would start with the children's ward.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, all I know to do is to walk through life with people. And I don't have all those answers. I live in that tension. I mean, if I could heal people, I'd do it. And there are people that I'd heal that apparently God has chosen not to at this point, right? Mm-hmm. So no, those are, I have no answer. There's no secret, button to press. It's, I do sometimes wonder in terms of the charlatan thing if there's more truth to the Leap of Faith movie than a lot of people allow. Remember the Steve Martin? Yeah. He's the healing evangelist. It's all rigged. And then this kid gets healed. Mm-hmm. And he takes off. Mm-hmm. I've thought about teaching a course on Pentecostalism in film. Elmer Gantry,
right.
Leap of Faith.
Yeah, Elmer Gantry is a classic.
The Apostle.
That's great. Yeah. Robert Duvall.
Yeah.
So good.
I love that film. Man, I love that film.
Okay, so first time we ate together, yep. You shared with me a beautiful sentiment about how you, and I won't say it as eloquently as you did, but how you hope that I won't have completely given up on faith at some level. And I do have a lot of born-again Christians like Mormon Stories because they feel like it deconstructs Mormonism, but they don't like, or they get concerned if they perceive that I've
deconstructed Christianity.
Yeah, and I even get exactly, and I even get people who think I identify as atheist, which I don't, or they think I identify as agnostic, which I don't. So I don't even think people really get where I stand with all this. But you in a very beautiful way encouraged me not to give up on faith. And I'll restate kind of what my answer was. And it's going to be a narrative that my listeners are familiar with. Maybe you've heard me talk about this, but this idea that God would create us and we're all flawed and we all have proclivities to sin, but that somehow we should be sad or beat ourselves up that we sin. That seems like kind of problem number one of my understanding of the atonement. It's like, man, if we were created, if we all sin and we were created that way, then what, do as good as you can, but don't beat yourself up about the fact that you make mistakes. That's just, we were designed that way. So we don't owe anyone some big favor for rescuing us from how we were designed. But then you add to that kind of, I don't know if Christology is the right word, but kind of just this idea that because we all sin, even though we were made to sin, then God has to pick an innocent, person, his own son, to suffer, to be able to make up for that. That's problem number two, that God's like inflicting pain on someone innocent, that sacrifice is even necessary to then make it right. I mean, if God can create us, God can make it right that we sin without having to punish someone in the meantime. Not to mention sort of the supernatural kind of superhero-like nature of Jesus and how he's God but human, and somehow we're supposed to be in reverence that he's divine but also be super remorseful that he had to suffer pain, but we don't know what it's like for a divine being to suffer pain. Just, it's very easy to get wrapped around the intellectual axle and to make sense of all this. But I almost get a little bit angry with the idea that an atonement is even necessary, that Jesus' suffering is even necessary. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that I think people should sin. Like, I literally live every day. How can I do the most good in the world and the least harm to myself and to my family? That's how I live every single day. So this isn't, I mean, we're all sinners. I can see that point of view. We all make mistakes. But like, you're talking to someone that literally wakes up every day saying how to do the least harm and the most good. So this is not me trying to excuse bad behavior. This is someone who tries to live as most of a Christian life as I can, not even knowing what I believe about Christ. But having said all that, I almost get angry and a little bit resentful at the idea that an atonement, as we call it, is even necessary, let alone that I'm supposed to like feel all grateful that it happened and all worshiping of God and Jesus when it feels like a setup. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But then I'll even take it one step further of my outrage. It was beautiful how you expressed such love and concern for me. On the other hand, just this idea that like, if I don't believe in Christ in just the right way or join just the right church, whether it's Pentecostals or Evangelicals or Catholic or Mormon or Muslim or whatever, like just this idea that life is this game where you've got to pick the right religion and obey it in just the right way, or like eternal suffering is your fate. Like all of that stuff, it's not that I don't want to do good. It's not that I don't want to believe. It's just that like none of that feels, I'm not loving, like if that God were actually a person, I'd tend to feel like he was more of a jerk than like some amazing being. I'm like, this is a bad setup. There's too many people that don't make it. It's too hard to know what's true. We're all broken. So it's almost like we're set up to fail unless we kneel. And then why do we have a being that wants us to kneel to them? You know, like they're just, and I don't mean any of this with disrespect. These are like genuine, this is just how these are the questions that have come from me really trying to engage with this story and take it seriously. And so I know that I just threw 1,000 things at you. I'm guessing very little of that is new, either about me or about your engagement with Christianity in general. But I'm guessing I have listeners that feel sympathies with a lot of what I've just expressed. Mm-hmm. How do you make sense of or respond to those types of concerns if you do? Or do you think I'm just being blasphemous and disrespectful? Because I actually don't mean disrespect.
Is that an either or? Maybe a both and. Well, no, thanks, John. I appreciate that, you entrusting that to me and everyone else that's listening in. I mean, you know, those are real questions. And you get to be my age and there's no point in pretending. You know, you need to try to speak the truth. I would understand that the human being was not created sinful, but fell. And I would understand that God loves each of us the way we are, but he loves us too much to leave us that way. I would understand that there is, to quote C.S. Lewis, a deeper magic than we can understand about the death of Jesus and his resurrection. I don't envision God as in heaven with his notepad catching us in every bad thing. Let me tell you how I envision God. I heard the story of a little boy who was tragically struck with a fatal illness, and his dad's talking to him shortly before his death. And he says, "Are you afraid to die, son?" And the boy said, "Not if God's anything like you, Dad." I don't understand God's essential nature to be mean-spirited or to unjustly punish. I do believe there's a wideness in God's mercy. I think when the apocalypse shows us, you know, these unbelievable multitudes from everywhere, that's a good indicator of how salvation's going to turn out. I suppose for me to think about bowing before God, I think what I've experienced from the Lord has just given me such gratitude that it's not something He demands. It's not the way I experience it. There have been people who have done wonderful things for me, and I'm just so full of gratitude for that. And I want other people to know about that. I want them to know this essential nature, this loving nature, that He would give His unique Son to make possible our salvation. Why was that necessary? I think it's the deep magic. I don't understand it. It's complex, isn't it? It's not, it's not 3 easy steps too. Those are deep things. And all I can do, I think, John, in response is to tell you what I've experienced and what I know. I saw this wonderful interview that I sent you a note about once with Stephen Colbert and Anderson Cooper, and Cooper says to him, "You're a person of faith," and he said, "Yes, I'm a Catholic." And he said, "But you don't proselytize, you don't evangelize." And he said, "Well, no, more Jesus for me," right? I think in this day and age, it's the testimonies that make sense. It's the self-authenticating nature of life and belief and experience. I don't see myself as, the example. As one preacher I heard say once, I'm just one beggar telling another beggar where he found bread, right?
You're not making a case. You're not trying to persuade anybody.
That's right. I'm not an apologist in that regard, because, people are at different phases in their life. We tend to be very joyous in our worship and very demonstrative in our worship. And when I've had some LDS friends come along to our church, I said, "Now, the decibel level's pretty good, pretty high here. We got a lot of good guitar players." And so, you may, it's full-bodied. But, what if you've suffered loss in that? Well, there's a place for lament, and the difference in whining and lament is pretty clear sometimes as we make our way through that. So, yeah, there's, it's complex, and I'm trying to remember all the details of it. To me, the atonement is an extraordinary act and gift, and it creates gratitude in me. And I don't, I don't have a personal need for everybody to agree with me or to mimic me or mirror me. I think if God has created us all, then we have not just the right, but sort of the obligation to discern our way forward. And so, one of the things I've been happy about is that our paths crossed. Because the thing I know, before we met, I knew you. And you had no idea who I was, but I'd watched so much of Mormon Stories, and you have been so honest and explicit at times that I knew something of your pain and your journey, and I knew you were not a person who was being frivolous, who was just trying to stir up trouble, but that you were honestly trying to figure this thing out. And I admire that. And I'm not here to convert you. I mean, it'd be great TV, wouldn't it? But I'm, so I am honored that we could have this kind of in-depth conversation. It occurs very rarely, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love it. Yeah, thank you. One sort of thank you for that, and one more trailing question on this
Sure.
theme, and then we'll go to others. There's this idea about who gets to heaven, and we talked about this at lunch today. But some people are asking: do Baptists go to heaven? Do Lutherans go to heaven? Do Catholics go to heaven? Do Mormons go to heaven? I remember you saying that it's kind of above your pay grade to kind of make that decision. But generally traditions –
and every one of your listeners should be glad for that.
Yeah. But there are general traditions that will condemn certain even if it's non-Christians. They'll just say, well, yeah, that's what the Bible says. Some are going to heaven and some aren't. The gate is narrow and Mormons are out or Catholics are out or non-Christians are out. Do you have anything you can add other than that's up to God? Because there are lines, right?
Yeah.
Your church, your doctrine does have lines.
Yeah, I think for me, my understanding is anybody that knows Jesus as Savior, regardless of their affiliations, if I get there, I'll see in heaven, right? I also think that anybody, there's this little piece tucked away in one of the Psalms that says, the one who seeks me with all his heart will find me. I do think, repeat this again, I do think there's a wideness in God's mercy. And I have the sense that if people are sincere in their seeking God, that God won't let them down.
So a Buddhist or a Muslim or an atheist,
if they find him, they find him. And I'm not second guessing him. I think the biblical texts indicate that Jesus is essential for salvation. In terms of the wideness in his mercy, there are texts that talk about the law of God kind of being in deep sort of structural human ways. Obviously, that's one of the questions that you think of often, isn't it? Or I certainly have. And so, yeah, it is above my pay grade, but I am optimistic from the hints we get in the apocalypse. Maybe that sounds odd to people. In terms of who's going to be there. I got a call once from our presiding bishop a few years back, and he said, I need to talk to you. And I said, okay. He says, I'm in trouble with this organization that he led. And I said, what did you do? He said, well, I told him that I thought there'd be more people in heaven than in hell. Mm-hmm. I said, well, the book of Revelation's anything to go on. I think you got pretty good biblical evidence there. So, I think we just try to discern our way through, and I think we try to live in ways that point people, to God. And I think the reality of life does a lot to our theology. When I got out of Bible college, I had a great understanding of marriage and divorce and all that, till people in my family started getting divorced.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so, I just think there are so many complexities that I guess I would say the best way I know is this way. Right. And I'm happy to leave to God everything else.
So I'm sensing in you at least some epistemic humility, that you don't feel like you know everything.
Oh no, that's not just epistemic. That's empirical fact. I gave up a long time ago on thinking I knew everything.
Right. Okay. I have to ask this question just about kind of secular worldviews for a second.
Sure.
So there's a way of being, let's just say, atheist or agnostic, which again, I don't use those titles for myself, but instead of saying it's the majesty of God, just saying it's the majesty of nature, that nature, whether or not there's a God, nature is complex and beautiful. And you don't have to attribute it to some sort of super divine being to just thrill in the beauty and the power and the majesty of nature, right? Mm-hmm. There's being kind and moral just because you believe in being kind and moral, not because there's a God, not because you were taught it. Some even argue that there might be more virtue in being good, not because of some expected reward or because of some imposed doctrinal, theological kind of set of beliefs, but just being honest or faithful because you want to be honest or faithful. None of that necessitates necessarily a belief in God or a belief in religion. I remember my son and daughter and my wife and I were driving down the road and we saw that 1-800 believe in God kind of thing. And my son was like, let's call him. So we called him. And part of the guy's argument is you need to believe in God because you'll like cheat on your wife if you don't believe in God. And I'm like, well, I think I know a lot of secular people that believe in being honest and faithful and moral, maybe even more highly moral. Right.
And some people who do believe in God that cheat on their wife.
Right. And so sometimes I wonder, is it necessary? You can believe in good things. You can love nature. You can do good without needing to have God beliefs or religious beliefs. And so that's part of the question. And the other part of the question is just like, when Christians say to me, I really hope you'll believe in Jesus or believe in God, I'm like, well, what does that mean? Does that mean I have to believe that a human being was born of a virgin and was crucified and died and resurrected after 3 days? Is that what it means to believe in Jesus? Or because I don't know I don't know if that bridge will ever be, because I don't know that that's knowable, right? It's just not. I've gotten to this place where I'm like, lots of people feel things and lots of people believe lots of things based on their feelings, and a lot of those things are irreconcilable. So are feelings even a reliable way of knowing anything? So I've gotten myself into this kind of epistemological mire where I just don't know that feelings are a way to discern truth beyond what's physical. It's not that I worship science or empiricism or materialism. It's just that I've lost confidence in basing beliefs on feelings, because my feelings betrayed me, and I know a lot of other people whose feelings have betrayed them. And it gets to the point where you wonder whether feelings are a great way to know anything. But if your wishes for me and if other Christians' wishes for me can just be, Christ, being a Christian means trying to do good in the world, trying to be kind, trying to fight for the disadvantaged, try to spend your life doing good, minimizing your harm. If that can be what it means to be Christian, or the way you describe being Christian, and I don't maybe describe it that way, but like I'm trying to live that way, then is there even a chasm that needs to be bridged? What if I'm, whatever that is, call it Christian, call it Unitarian Universalist, call it humanistic, but we're both working towards the same end, to alleviate suffering, to fight for the disenfranchised, to do good, does it matter if we call it Christian or not, or if we put a historical figure named Jesus into the equation, or if I'm just following those principles that were actually inspired by my teaching, my upbringing, my Christian upbringing. But I don't frame it that way anymore. But in essence, I'm still trying to live that way. What if it doesn't matter how we call it, or what heroes or people or names we give to it? It's just trying to do good. Can that be enough? Can that bridge the divide? Can that obviate a divide? Do you understand what I'm asking?
Yeah. I mean, it's great questions, and you've got me confused with somebody that knows answers to all that. I would say it's not that you have to believe in a creator. In some ways, you could say you get to believe in one.
Mm-hmm.
It's, in the Christian tradition, there has been this understanding that creation itself points to the glory of God, and that you can revel in the creation, and it's a wonderful creation. I mean, I've spent most of my life in East Tennessee. It's very beautiful, but Utah has its own beauty, right? And this is the first time I've seen all the mountains covered in snow, and it looks kind of Arctic to me, right? I mean, it's just gorgeous. But if that is creation, is it enough just to revel in it?
Right.
And as far as getting rewards, I mean, I don't do things for my wife and my daughters, and especially my grandchildren, because I'm trying to get a reward. I do that because I love them. Mm-hmm. I love them more than anything else. I would have failed Abraham's test. Mm-hmm. I'm not that good of a man. Mm-hmm.
Some say that wasn't a good test.
Yeah, well, I tend to side there, but I mean, the sacrifice required, he's better than I in that. I just love them, and I don't do what I do for them to earn anything. I don't even do what I do for them to earn their love. Right? So my understanding of God and Jesus is much more relational than transactional, I would say. And that the experience of being brought into him is transformative. And I think one of the differences I've learned in some of my conversations with my LDS friends is, for the LDS tradition, there's this understanding of exaltation that you work for, and I don't mean work as a bad word, and that, there is this kind of becoming God or God-like, or however you want to nuance it. In the Christian tradition, the book of Revelation, for example, there is kind of a theosis going on, but you're being drawn into God, right? You're sitting on the throne with the Son, the Lamb, who's sitting on the throne with the Father. So for me, it's much more relational than all of that. And there are lots of ways of interpreting the data and the evidence, right? And my understanding is how that points to him, and I want to be I want him to know how much I appreciate it, right? I mean, when somebody does something for you that is selfless, I'm overwhelmed by it. And so, what explains what explains the altruism? What explains all that? Is it just in our DNA? Because if it is, it certainly missed a whole swath of people, right? So I think, my understanding is that as we draw nearer to that we are drawn into him. And I, for one, need all the purifying I can get. It's like, being drawn into fire, and everything but the purest stuff gets burned up, right? So, I mean, that's how I would conceive of it, that whole kind of engagement. Cicero had written something arguing basically the reason we know the gods exist is because of creation. And he wasn't Christian, he was just, he was Cicero. And of course you get all of that. So yeah, I mean, it is possible, I would assume, to worship the creation rather than the creator. And it's possible to say, well, we don't have enough evidence to know if it's the creator. who the Creator is. Yeah, well, that may be. I mean, I'm comfortable with my own understanding of that. So then, what becomes the common denominator for? Are we all doing the same thing for the same end? Right? I mean, it's a great question. And I think it's, one of my favorite Beatles songs on the White Album was Savoy Truffle. You are what you eat, right? And you can tell I put that into practice. John, the epistles, but John basically says you are what you do, right? And so I think that there are these reflections, certainly, of the divine image in us, as I would see it, that can account for that kind of altruism and that kind of empathy. I think evolutionary theory kind of argues against all that, right? So something's going on in this equation that kind of transcends. You got a lot of good people. Well, thank God for it, because we desperately needed it these days, especially. So that's kind of how I would think about it.
Yeah. I mean, I certainly like the idea of Christ in the sense of like to have someone to try and be like, to have someone to aspire to be like. It's someone who's always good, who's always kind, who's always patient, who's always forgiving. I know there's examples where he gets mad, but just in general, I do like the idea of like an idea of an image of a person that we could all strive to be like.
Yeah. And
that Christ's central message was kindness and forgiveness and charity and love. That's all I see a lot of utility in that, and I hate to reduce it to utilitarianism, but I do see the value in that. Yeah. I think if I had to summarize maybe how Christianity got polluted for me, whether it's Mormonism or Protestantism or whatever, there was so much exclusivity talk. And in some ways, Christ poisoned me for Christianity, or at least a certain type of Christianity, by making me care about the marginalized and then being taught that so many people are going to be on the outs. Those two things just don't jive. If Christ is all about the marginalized, then why was a plan put together where not even half of all of his children end up as Christian? Like, why was the plan marginalizing so many? So I think the great bridge for that I've heard from you is sort of just a more universalistic, Unitarian kind of streak where you just say God's loving and there's a lot more mercy and grace than we know about. And there's a lot of that in Mormonism, which is God will make it all right in the end. God's fair, God's loving. And that can allow us to have some boundaries that make us feel like we're doing good and that help us strive for something better, but still kind of leave this remainder where a bunch of people aren't left out. Because if a bunch of people are left out, then God wasn't a very good designer. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And God isn't a very good Christian.
Yeah, and I think we're digging deep in that. There are individuals that disqualify themselves.
But even then, there's a more charitable interpretation, which is they've got a broken brain. They literally, we don't know if they're a sociopath, if they were born without a conscience, and that's a chemical thing. We know so much about the brain and how it can be manipulated and damaged.
I was at this conference and people were troubled by what they perceived to be the violence in the book of Revelation, and that they could not believe in a God that was portrayed in this way. And at the time, I was reading the Wiesenthal files, and in particular, I'd been reading a chapter on Joseph Mengele, and I thought about doing a paper entitled "The Apocalypse Meets the Wiesenthal Files." Mengele dies on a beach after these horrid experiments on these twins and these children. I think there's a bottom to the pool somewhere.
Sure.
And so I don't fit in the in the apocalypse, you get this vision of the doors being open, the gates being open, that the kings of the nations bring in the glories of the nations, and up till that point, the kings have all been in opposition to the Lamb. And yet you get this list twice of those who are outside. So in my kind of grappling with that, it seems to me that there are lines, but I'm quite content, and I think that the biblical text, from my vantage point, gives us the best advice I know of in answering that, but I'm quite happy to leave those final decisions with God.
Right. Yeah. So there are people that do bad things, but there's also a lot we don't understand. And the only type of Christianity I can embrace is one that has a really wide net of mercy and love and justice.
There's a guy named Clark Pinnock. Clark went on to be with the Lord a few years back. Brilliant guy, honest guy, and he wrote a book called A Wideness in God's Mercy. You might ought to have a look at that sometime. Clark was about your height, and he just wanted to know the truth. He just wanted to know about God. And it led him to that text in Revelation, and he tried to think through it on that basis. And he's not a universalist, but he's optimistic, right? And I would say that, I'm optimistic. And it's important to share the good news, but, one theologian in the early church said we need to preach the gospel and, when necessary, use words.
Right. So, yeah. Well, Dr. Chris Thomas, there's so much more we could talk about, but I got to go pick my daughter up from
well, you're choosing the better portion.
Yeah, I got to go pick them up. So you're a gentleman and a scholar and a lovely human. And is there anything else you want to leave us with to close tonight?
Well, it's an honor to be here. I've enjoyed the conversation. I appreciate the depth of the conversation. I appreciate how seriously you've taken it. Not that you don't ever, but I mean, and so I'm honored by that. I don't expect that everybody agrees with my various readings of the Book of Mormon or biblical texts, but I do it with a good heart. I do believe that it's possible to know Jesus as your Savior, as a sanctifier who is the way forward out of desperation, that you can know Him in such a powerful way that you're immersed with His Spirit. I do believe it's possible to be healed physically, emotionally, spiritually, and I do believe He's returning. I know that's not au courant, but I do believe that. And so, it's been wonderful to be with you. I suppose the other thing I would just say is, as I got to know you without you knowing me, I just felt burdened to pray for you. And I was, very open to how I needed to pray for you. And so, that comes from a good place, and you received it.
Absolutely. I'm honored.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Chris Thomas, will you join us again sometime?
It'll be my pleasure.
All right. The book is A Pentecostal Reads the Book of Mormon. Check it out. Published by?
CPT Press.
Okay. Available on Amazon, I'm assuming?
Mm-hmm.
Any future works we can expect from you, or are you?
Well, I'm working on this implied reader thing, and I've been doing a paper for a conference on the mother of Jesus in the Johannine tradition. Mary, his mom shows up, but she's never named.
Right.
What's going on there? So I've been exploring that.
Isn't it Mary Magdalene? Isn't that what some people assume?
No, well, the mother of Jesus, no, not the mother. But why is why is it the mother, not Mary?
Right. Okay.
And she's entrusted to the beloved disciple who's never named. It's very intriguing stuff.
Okay. Beautiful. All right, Chris. Have a good night. Come again. Thanks for all your work. Thanks for your contributions to our people.
Thank you.
You're a good man. Let's stay in touch.
All righty.
All right, listeners. Thanks for joining us today on Mormon Stories. Support us if you can at mormonstories.org. Thanks to everyone who makes this possible. And we'll be coming at you again in the weeks and months ahead with more episodes. So stay in touch, and we'll see you guys all again soon. Take care.